Good morning, everyone. Welcome to those in the Great Hall and to those who are watching us on Zoom. This morning, our guest speaker is Reverend Canon Allisyn Thomas, and her topic is Breaking Through, Barrier to Authentic Spirituality. The Reverend Canon Allisyn Thomas has been an Episcopal priest and spiritual director for the last 21 years. Recently retired from parish ministry, she has served in a variety of ministries, including Associate Rector at St. Bartholomew's in Poway, Canon for Spiritual Formation, and Canon to the Ordinary in the Bishop's Office, Dean of the School for Ministry, and Sub-Dean and Canon for Spiritual Formation at St. Paul's Cathedral here in San Diego. In retirement, Allisyn continues to see people in spiritual direction, serves as Director of Field Education at the School for Ministry, teaches, leads retreats, and assists in the Bishop's Office with liturgical planning. Allisyn is married to Skip Thomas, a happily retired Deputy Public Defender. They make their home in Point Loma. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Reverend Canon Allisyn Thomas.
Well, hello, everybody. Hello. Let's start with a prayer, and this is the prayer of St. Anselm. Let us pray. O Lord my God, teach my heart this day where and how to find you. You have made me and remade me. You have bestowed on me all the good things I possess, and still I do not know you. I have not yet done that for which I was made. Teach me to seek you, for I cannot seek you unless you teach me, or find you unless you show yourself to me. Let me seek you in my desire. Let me desire you in my seeking. Let me find you by loving you. Let me love you when I find you. Amen. So good to see you all. Good to be here, both in person and online. Today's forum, as Stacy just said, revolves around breaking through spiritual barriers, or barriers that hinder our spirituality. But as you can imagine, that's a pretty broad topic. And probably you don't want to sit here for the next day or so. Well, maybe you do, but I don't. So I'm going to narrow it down a little bit for the purposes of the time we have. And I'm going to focus this day primarily on our spiritual practices, because the health and vibrancy of our spiritual life and our spirituality goes hand in hand with the health and vibrancy of our spiritual practices. Spiritual practices or disciplines help us to consciously live into the dimension of our spiritual life. They are not ends in and of themselves, but they are means of grace. And so if nothing else, by the time you leave here this morning, the question is, and we'll be considering it, is what barriers do we put up that hinder our spiritual practices? Just think about that for a second, and then I'm going to assist you in thinking about that. But I anticipate that I hope that when you leave here today, you're going to give this even more thought. And to address this question, we have to talk about discernment, because discernment is key in where we need to be, what spiritual practices work for us at any given point in time, and where it is we need to grow. So I'm going to read two quotes, and then I'm going to ask you what, if anything, you see them having in common. And the first one is by a woman named Marjorie Thompson from her book, Soul Feast, An Invitation to the Christian Spiritual Life. And she writes, "Every spiritual discipline tutors us in relationship. Words like disciple and discipline share the root meaning of being taught. Jesus' disciples were taught by his words and example in a living relationship. Our discipleship is no different. It grows in the embrace of a living relationship with the divine spirit. That's the first quote. The second one is by Frank Rogers from the book called Practicing Our Faith. Frank writes, discernment is the intentional practice by which a community or an individual seeks, recognizes, and intentionally takes part in the activity of God in concrete situations. So, as you were listening to those quotes, anything particular resonate with you? Anything that you saw that said, yeah, they're getting at the same thing, but maybe in a somewhat different way? Roxanne?
I think the word discipline, because I'm such a rebel, I blanch at just sort of reflexively thinking of discipline as teaching, and then, of course, learning is much more thinking.
Yeah. For those who couldn't hear, the inner rebel in Roxanne kind of, and I think a lot of us do, we blanch at the term discipline. We don't like it, but we do have to have a certain amount of discipline, and discipline is a form of teaching. It's not just following rules or a compulsion to follow rules, so it's important. So something else that these two statements have in common is that they both stress the relational and intentional aspect of spiritual practices and discernment. We need God, we need community, we need each other in order to discern. We can discern, well, I have lots of opinions about things, but that doesn't mean I'm discerning. You know what I mean? So we need to have some sort of system of accountability. And that's really important in both our discernment and in the development of our spiritual practices. So they will connect us with God and with each other. Both stress how spiritual practices and discernment are concrete rather than conceptual. A person can read 1,000 books on prayer, but chances are they will not have a vibrant prayer life unless they actually start to do it. So it's really important that we acknowledge here that we're dealing with concrete actions, concrete thoughts. So once again, the health and vibrancy of our spiritual life and spirituality goes hand in hand with the vibrancy of our spiritual practices, which then goes hand in hand with our intentionality in order to have this be concrete. So as we go forward in this morning, let's keep these three things in mind when we think about our spiritual practices and breaking through spiritual barriers. The first one is discernment. Second one is intentionality. And the third one is concrete action. We're going to need all three. We often stay stuck spiritually because we're not specific, concrete, or intentional enough in our spiritual practices. Now, as I go through this outline of today's talk, I want to say that no shame, blame, or attack. This isn't about making you feel like you're a miserable worm because you may not be engaging in your spiritual practices like you think you should. This is just something hopefully that'll make you curious, make you wonder. As Roxanne just said, some people rebel against this kind of specificity. They want a free-flowing relationship with God. But it's very hard to have a free-flowing relationship with anybody, let alone God, if we don't set aside some time for it and some intentionality about it. Sometimes it's easier to think about our intimate relationships or our closest friends or something like that. My husband and I can banter for hours about the most inane things, but we can do that because we also set aside specific time to be together. We do it on a regular basis. It's interesting with us both being retired now because you would think theoretically, you know, we have all this time to spend together. It hasn't really worked out that way. So we still need to make time for each other. But it's no different with God. When was the last time any of you, any of us, made a play date with God? You know, it can be as simple as, gee, God, let's go to the beach. let's have a conversation. I mean, let's go for a walk. Let's go shopping. I don't take God shopping. God would weep. But you know what I'm saying. It's like a lot of times we can make just the things we do on a day-to-day basis something concrete if we say, God, I'm going to do this, or Jesus, let's go do this together. So another factor which contributes to our being stuck, and I'm going to talk more about this shortly, is perfectionism. Following the rules becomes more important than the reason the rules exist. Or in other words, if I don't have 30 minutes to pray, I'm not going to. Because I can only pray at 8 o'clock for 30 minutes, or it's not going to take. So here are some other things that can get in the way. Fear, believe it or not. Fear can be a real barrier to our spirituality, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that as well. Our expectations, what we expect to come out of it, out of our spiritual practices, that can really get in the way if our expectations aren't met. Sometimes it's simply a lack of vision. You know, it's like we just can't really see what it is we're supposed to do. Sometimes it's denial. Oh, Jesus and I are fine. We're good. Self-centeredness. What more do I need? We under or overestimate ourselves. And this one, and for those of you, I see a couple of folks who were there from the last Women Together talk I did, an outdated concept of God and or Jesus. This really, really gets in the way of our spirituality. And then inadequate knowledge of what resources are available. You know, or different kinds of practices. You know, maybe we grew up with some and we don't know that there's like a whole bunch more. We're just not aware of them. Are there any others that come to mind that I didn't mention that you can think of?
Distraction.
I'm sorry, what?
Distraction.
Distraction. Oh yeah, I could probably spend a whole hour on that, but then I'd get distracted. That's a good one. Yes, absolutely. For those of us who are a little ADD, you know, I'm going to the kitchen to get a glass of milk, but on the way I noticed that the table needs to be dusted, and then when I was dusting the table, I saw a book that I wanted to read, but it reminded me of something I needed to check on my computer, and yeah, I think we've all done that. So, distractions, anything else that comes to mind? Okay. So, I'm going to deal with the top three, my top three. Not, well, probably for me too, but as Stacy said, I've been a spiritual director for going on 22 years now. And these are the things that people tend to bring to me often about the state of their spiritual life. The big three are perfectionism, fear, and an outdated concept of God/Jesus. So I'm going to deal with those three first. So perfectionism. Perfectionism, I think, is one of the great spirit killers out there. And it's one of the greatest ways, and unfortunate ways, that we sabotage our relationship with God. And while specificity allows for discipline and reliability, perfectionism gives no room for the Holy Spirit to act in unexpected ways. Think of all the times maybe when you've expected something to happen in a certain way, and you're looking this way, and you've missed this glorious miracle right over here. So, you know, perfectionism can keep us stuck and keep us from seeing things that God would like us to see. As I said, if people cannot do something in just a certain way at a certain time, then they won't do it. Perfectionism can lead to poor self-esteem. How hard is it to pray 5 minutes in the morning? Well, it shouldn't be very hard. I can't do it, so I'm a lousy Christian. I'm not a spiritual person. Da-da-da-da. Before long, we stop doing it. It can also lead to judging others. in my humble opinion, which can be sort of killing. And as Episcopalians, maybe you can relate to this, and I'm sure none of you ever do this. But I mean, if I can figure out when to stand and kneel, how hard can it be for that person? Likewise, what is wrong with me if I don't know when to do the sign of the cross? Everyone else seems to know what they're doing, but I don't know what I'm doing. So this sort of perfectionism can really, really get in the way. Type A tend to have a real problem with this perfectionism, and I like to give them a very pastoral response, which is just get over yourself. Allow God to be the perfect one. We don't need to be. In a lovely book that was written, oh my gosh, I think back in the 70s, in Is Your God Too Small by the Reverend J.D. Phillips, he writes, and this is a product of the time in which he wrote it, God is truly perfection, but he is no perfectionist. 100% is not God. So, can you think about how perfectionism maybe has gotten in the way of your spiritual practices or your relationship with God? Sherry, you're nodding. Can you think of something in particular?
Yeah, a bit left over from a childhood experience of prayer life, and I was raised Catholic, and so, you know, there's lots of that kind of perfection boundary making about what's acceptable and what's not. But I remember as a kid saying my prayers at night and in the morning, kneeling at the side of my bed, and I don't do that anymore. You know, it's like my legs are out. You gotta be kidding, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
But I do still, even though I'm 77, I do still notice that I don't do that. And so therefore, my prayers may not count. You know what I mean? And, yes.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm going to talk about this shortly in a bit, but I call that the parental hangover. You know? Anyone else? Okay. But that is a great one. I was told, I was taught, this is how you do it, and this is the way you do it. And my knees don't work nearly as well as they used to either, so I get that. The second one is fear. Maybe some of you read the book Dune, and all the Dune books, science fiction books, but one of the great mantras from the book of Dune is, fear is the mind killer. Mind killer. And I think, I've always thought that's so strong. So fear and perfectionism often go together. We try to be perfect so others won't see our flaws, including in our spirituality. Of course, all this begs the question, what is it that we're afraid of? Well, first off, there's a fair amount of fear in our culture right now anyway. We've got economic fear, fear of losing jobs, health, insurance, retirement accounts, climate change, way of life, rights. I could go on and on. We have a fear of violence. We have a fear of the other. We have a fear that things may not get better. Regardless of what anyone thinks of QAnon, the fact that such a group exists is proof that there is a lot of fear in society. And so we're seeing it in lots of different ways. So once again, what does this have to do with spirituality? Well, I think sometimes we have a fear that God isn't out there. Or if God is, God doesn't care. And related to this, God may be out there, but God may not answer my prayers, especially if I don't kneel at the side of the bed. God is not taking advantage of the benefit of my good advice. I think we have fear that our hearts are going to get broken. What if we trust in God and God doesn't come through, at least in the way we want God to come through. And then this is one of the ironic ones. I think sometimes we fear that God will answer our prayers. And then once God does, we're going to have to do something about it. Some of you have heard this story, so I'll make it brief. But when I was going through the discernment process for ordination, I told God, giving God the benefit of my advice, that I would go through the discernment process on 3 conditions. The first one is that I got to keep my boyfriend, I got to keep my job, and I got to keep my car. Loved the car. And then I got through it somehow, right? And then I said, okay, I'll go to seminary on 3 conditions. I get to keep my boyfriend, I get to keep my job, and I get to keep my car. And I was terrified. Because I was terrified. But after a while, you know, so I was going to a commuter program up through the Claremont colleges for my first couple of years, and I realized that I couldn't do all 3. I couldn't keep all 3 and be faithful to this call. So I broke up with my boyfriend, I quit my job, and I sold my car. Okay, God won. But you know what I'm saying? It's like every time I kept on thinking, well, if I just put up these insurmountable barriers, then there's no way this is going to happen. And then when it did, it's like, oh, this is going to require something of me I really don't want to do. And thank God, in my case, that God won, because it's been much better. I got a better job. My boyfriend became my husband, and I've got a fine car. You know, so everything works out. We have a fear of God, which is closely related to the outdated visions of God, that God is frightening and capable of putting us in hell and won't hesitate for a nanosecond to do so if we step out of line. You know, sometimes for those of us raised in the Episcopal Church, this seems so odd. One time I had dinner with some friends. One had been raised Roman Catholic, the other had been raised Jewish, and I think maybe a couple of glasses of wine was involved in this discussion, but they started talking to each other about who grew up with more guilt. And finally, the Jewish woman won because she gave her mother pain at childbirth. But you know, we laugh about it, and they laughed about it, but it's, nonetheless, these were things that they could readily come up with because they understood this kind of fear that if you don't do it right, it's not going to work out. And the last thing I want to talk about, just in terms of these barriers, is the outdated vision or notion of God and Jesus. We have, in particular, a murky view of Jesus. For those of us who went to Sunday school, growing up, probably had teachings about Jesus. You probably saw that picture, most churches had it, of the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus, very pale, with the light shining down on him, you know, and, or maybe the picture of Jesus on the rock with all the little white kids, and that's what Jesus looked like, and that's what Jesus was all about. Jesus was nice to kids. That really doesn't work as we get older. That notion really doesn't work. And what happens a lot of times, we may not realize it, is that as we grow up, our notion of God does not. That we still carry these old teachings and visions. Nothing bad with them. They were age appropriate maybe at the time, but as I said, they're not going to work with some of the grays and disappointments of adulthood. So other things that this outdated vision, and we sort of talked about this, hint on this, especially with the perfectionism and fear, is that God is the resident policeman, policewoman, police person, right? That if we, once again, step out of line, God will not hesitate for a nanosecond to do something horrible to us or damn us to a life of grossness. A parental hangover. Some people, because, you know, when we talk about, especially God as father, or, you know, we try and make it more inclusive, God as mother, if you don't have a good view or didn't grow up with perhaps a healthy parental figure, this can get in the way. I've talked to a lot of women who had hard relationships with their father. And so when God's referred to as father, it's really, they can't even relate to a benevolent, loving father. It's just not part of their worldview. So this parental hangover. And then the other one I think is Jesus, meek and mild. When I think about some of the disappointments of life, Jesus, meek and mild, ain't gonna cut it. The Jesus I want is the one who went into the temple with the whips and then overturned the tables. But we don't tend to pull up that Jesus a lot of times when we think about what it is that we really need, especially if we grow up thinking that Jesus was the cute one, the easy one, the sweet one, the soft one. It can be really hard. One of the things that happens with our notions of God is what I would call cultural differences. Every culture, especially Jesus, tends to make Jesus in its own image to help make Jesus relatable. That's fine. I mean, that makes sense, right? But sometimes we have to look, and I think that's part of the white Jesus, you know, that I grew up with, you know, here in this area. But we need to be able to see maybe Jesus in all his iterations to understand how much more he is than we tend to think. We tend to make Jesus in the image of the era of whatever's going on. So, for instance, the era that produced the movie Ben-Hur is very different from the one that produced Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar, which is very different from the one that produced The Passion of the Christ, which is very different from the one that has the Left Behind series. No, so you can sort of look at what's going on in society by the movies that take place. I also thought at some point it might be interesting to do a film study, you know, of these different movies, and just then talk about what does that say about the times, and what kind of hangover do we have from watching all those movies. Another problem is that we tend to make Jesus in our own image, whatever that is. And so this is a great quote from Nadia Bolz-Weber, who's a Lutheran pastor. And she said in her book, Pastrix, The Cranky, Beautiful Faith of a Sinner Saint, "I need a God who is bigger and more nimble and more mysterious than what I could understand and contrive. Otherwise, it can feel like I'm worshiping nothing more than my own ability to understand the divine." So I can see some nodding heads. It's like, I think we tend to do that. Again, that's why Jesus and I don't go shopping, because he might have different views about what I should wear than I do. But we do tend to do it. So you can see then, though, how all these different views of Jesus and God come together into this great conglomeration, which is sort of like a Jell-O salad. And I don't know about you, I can't stand Jell-O salad. You know, but people put the weirdest stuff in Jell-O. I don't get it. But nonetheless, we do have all these different views of God, and we don't really think about who is God? What is God? Who is Jesus? So what can we do? What can we do? Well, let's talk about some of the things that hold us back. And before I go on, any thoughts, any comments? Yes.
So I have problem thinking about Jesus as Father. I mean, God as Father, although I have a wonderful Father. Or Jesus as Mother. There were some issues there. Okay, so if Jesus isn't a father, and Jesus isn't a mother, and Jesus isn't the perfect parent, and we want to conceive of him just as creator, what do we do?
Well, So we have these views, Jesus and God. I'm gonna use both if that's okay. We could look at Jesus as God as Father, Mother, God as Father, Mother, and that gives us, I think, some parameters of what God may be all about. And so if we take away those parameters, am I getting, yeah. If we take away those parameters, what do we get? What do we do? How do we live with that? How do we worship that, right? Is that, well, I don't know. I think as adults, maybe as unsatisfactory as this may sound, I think we're called to live into mystery. And we're called to live in a liminal space in which it's not one or the other, A or B, male or female, all that stuff. And that it's sort of like walking, there's a book called The Cloud of Unknowing, but to sort of walk into this unknown space and say, I'm going to trust God's there and I don't know what's going to happen. So for those of us who like certainty, that can be really difficult. But it's also very satisfactory. John?
I think sometimes, the fourth gospel has all these images of Jesus that are not human. The way, the truth, the life. And I think if we read more of the New Testament, we find a lot more imagination. And in the book of Revelation, he calls himself the bright morning star. How's that?
Yes, thank you. Yes, John. Oh, John.
Every morning I live in Arizona. I have a balcony, and I face the west and I stand there. And every morning I stand up and walk there and watch the light shine in. The sun is much fun, and it's amazing how things fall into place. I'm alone now for the first time in my life after 40, 50, 60 years of living in the community. And I have to reorganize everybody's school. And I find little by little grace, and that's an important word in our lives as Christians, developing more and more so that I can make something out of each day. It's not always fun or easy. Life and grace are important commodities as we walk on the spiritual journey until we ultimately go into the ultimate presence of God. Never felt fire that outbound dead once, but that's okay. It's a mystery, and it's a beauty, and it's light upon light, and we're all dead together.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, two things, if you weren't able to hear them, John was talking about how throughout the New Testament, Jesus refers to himself in different ways, and that certainly that is one thing we can do. Is I think we have a great scriptural illiteracy, and it's helpful to look at the images of Jesus, but also with how Jesus refers to himself. But also then, as Andrew was saying, a willingness to just be in presence, wherever that might be, and let the presence envelop us and guide us and tell us. Sherry?
Alan Watts has a book called Your God is Too Small. And I read it a few times because I keep banging up against, I have this picture, and I'm often reluctant to let go of it in terms of what I think God looks like or Jesus looks like. But from that book comes the notion that, at least for me, it's like the blind man and the elephant. It depends on, I don't know what it depends on, but sometimes my relationship with God is like in my hand on the body of the elephant. Sometimes I have the tail, sometimes I have the trunk, sometimes I have the leg, but
But that's brilliant, because I think we see through the glass dark, dimly.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. There was, by the way, and I've tried to find it and I haven't, but maybe some of the brains around here can. I think National Geographic did a series on Jesus a long time ago, Visions and Pictures of Jesus, and I've been trying to, or PBS, one of them, and it was sort of looking at some of these things, but yeah, sometimes I'm just looking at the big belly of the elephant and not the rest of it. So, here, yes.
Thanks, Tony. My husband is Palestinian, and his family is the oldest Roman Catholic family in Bethlehem. They came there as tour guides in the 12th century. And so we lived in Bethlehem. And I had one thing to say about Jesus after living in the Middle East. He sort of had to be God to live in the Middle East.
It was a hard place.
Yeah.
So let's, so this is helpful. So I want to, we've talked about some of the things that get in the way. Let's talk about some things we can do to get out of this conundrum of breaking through our barriers. The first one is to get real. When I think about spiritual practices, we really have to, we break through them by doing them, but we got to do them. From a book called Practicing Our Faith by Dorothy Bass, she writes that spiritual practice should address fundamental human needs and conditions through concrete human acts. So once again, they should address fundamental human needs and conditions through concrete human acts. So our practices are the human places where people cooperate with God in doing what needs to be done. We're doing it together. Practices are practical. Someone in need of hospitality doesn't need a book on hospitality. Right? I think sometimes we'll read and study things to death. Spiritual practice should make sense. Should make sense to us. Now, when I was in seminary, for most of the time, I engaged in silent prayer. I like that. But some of you heard this story, but when I was getting ready to move back from New York to San Diego, my last semester, I'd be in prayer, or try to be in prayer, and there is this vision that if you have a thought while praying, that picture a river, and that a boat comes along, and you put the thought on the boat and let it drift away. So I'm engaged in this, I thought, practice of quiet, and I'm thinking, I need tape. I need packing tape. Okay, the boat comes along. This is just a canoe. I'm just going to put that packing tape thought on the canoe. Then I'm thinking, well, I'm going to need boxes. I'm going to need a lot of boxes. How am I going to get the boxes here? How am I going to get, I was on the 4th floor of a building with no elevator. How am I going to get them to, by the time it was done, I had this vision of these boats crashing into each other as they're going down a waterfall. So I decided for that period of time, I was just going to do the daily office because I just needed something that didn't allow my mind to wander. So once again, they need to make sense given everything that's going on in your life. And don't worry, you don't have to do the same practice for the rest of your life, because different things happen to us. And so here's 3 basic questions to ask when you're thinking about engaging in a spiritual practice. The first one is, what am I deeply attracted to and why? So for me, a lot of times it is silence. It's ironic being an Episcopal priest because we use so many words, but maybe that's the way I counteract it, is to be in silence. That's really attractive to me. But for other people, it's not. They like the structure. They love the structure of the office. They love yoga. They love the physicality of certain types of spiritual practices. That's all good, but just think about what are you deeply attracted to and why. Second question is, where do you feel God is calling you to stretch and grow?
I don't want it.
God's not calling me to stretch or grow?
Yes, but I don't want it.
Okay.
Too bad.
You,
It's too bad.
uh-oh, fight on aisle 6. Yeah, I know. When something, especially this is where fear can get in the way. When I think about what I'm afraid of, then I have, that may point to where I need to stretch and grow. I mean, speaking for myself, but I mean, there's different ways. So it's like, what are you attracted to and why? Where are you being called to stretch and grow? And the third one is, what kind of balance do you need in your life? Are there parts of your life that you're neglecting or others that you're spending too much time on? So as we think about practices, and especially if we're trying new practices, those are 3 pretty handy questions to ask yourself. And then after that, consider what is realistic. Honor personal limitations. Honor them. Don't think you're not doing it right. Just examine them. So it could be, if I pray in this way, it can only be done this way. Why am I thinking that? Oh, I'm thinking that because this is how I was raised, or because I've seen people I admire do it this way. That doesn't mean it's right for me. Or it doesn't mean as I get older that it's right for me. Things that are better for me now were not the same even 5 years ago. That's just part of the development process. That's nothing to complain about. It's just something to be interested in. And your personal circumstances at this point in life. You know, like what's going on with you? It's like when I was moving back to San Diego, my circumstances pretty much drove me into a different place. Not bad or good, but it's better to honor them and then engage in some sort of spiritual practice than to not honor them and then end up doing nothing or to do it with resentment. Because I think that's something that happens. The last thing I want to say in regards to that is map out the perfect day. You know, a lot of times we keep our calendars, even for those of us retired. What would make you excited about getting up in the morning? Sometimes it's just breathing. But sort of figure out what's your perfect day. And then for 7 days, keep a journal of your prayer practices, or of your spiritual practice, not just your prayer practice, but your spiritual. Just keep a journal. It doesn't have to be long, but just see what's happening in the course of a week. And then at the end of that week, take a look at what you've written and see, well, this seems to be working for me right now. You know, God and I are good with this right now. Or it's not. Maybe it's time to do some adjustment, some amendment. You know what I'm saying? It's just, but to hold ourselves accountable. I think a lot of times it's getting back to that free-flowing relationship with God. Well, part of what happens is that we can hold ourselves accountable in this as well. So once again, from Marjorie Thompson in her book Soul Feast, she says, God is the one who calls us into relationship, and God does everything possible to restore us when we have wiggled out of this mutual relationship. God's love lies at the root of our hunger for God. Love is God's hunger for relationship with us. Think about it. Has it ever occurred to you that God is starved for our companionship? No. It's not just about us. It's about this mutuality. So I'm going to close with a beautiful prayer by a poet named Daniel Ladinsky from his book, God Would Kneel Down. I think God might be a little prejudiced, for once he asked me to join him on a walk through the world, and we gazed into every heart on the earth, and I noticed he lingered a bit longer before any face that was weeping, and before any eyes that were laughing. And sometimes we passed a soul in worship. God too would kneel down. I have come to learn God adores his creation. Amen, and thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Allison. That concludes today's forum. Next week is Pride Sunday. There will be no forum, but the Sunday after that, our guest speaker will be Charlie Beal, who is the new artistic director of the San Diego Gay Men's Chorus. Have a great Sunday, everyone.